You're still coming tomorrow, right? The voice on the phone tried to sound casual, but there was a crack in it, like something already breaking. Ethan Caldwell didn't answer right away. He sat in the far corner of the restaurant, fingers resting against a glass of water he hadn't touched, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the reflection of candlelight. Around him, the room moved in soft elegance, silverware clinking, low laughter rolling across polished tables, waiters gliding between guests like shadows trained not to exist. But at Ethan's table, there was nothing. No food, no conversation, just silence that felt heavier than anything money could buy. "No," he said finally, his voice low, steady, and empty. "I'm shutting everything down." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled into the space around him like a decision already made hours ago. On the other end, the voice paused, searching for something to say, but Ethan had already pulled the phone away. He ended the call without another word, placing it face down beside the untouched glass. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there, a man who once moved markets with a sentence now unable to move himself from a chair. The restaurant was one of the finest in the city, the kind where reservations were booked months in advance and the lighting was designed to make everything, and everyone, look just a little more important. A place where power dressed itself in tailored suits and whispered deals over aged bourbon. And Ethan Caldwell had once been the center of rooms like this. A billionaire CEO, a builder of empires, the kind of man people watched when he entered and followed when he spoke. But tonight, no one approached him. Not because they didn't recognize him. They did. It was because something about him felt off, like a storm that had already passed but left the air unsettled. The staff knew better than to interrupt. The manager had already given quiet instructions. Leave him alone, give him space, don't ask questions. And so they did what they always did best. They pretended not to see. All except one. Across the room, near the edge of the service station, Maya Brooks paused for half a second longer than she should have. Tray balanced perfectly in one hand, posture straight, expression calm. She had been moving all night without being noticed, slipping between tables, refilling glasses, clearing plates before anyone had to ask. Invisible, just like the job required. But her eyes didn't miss things. They never had. And right now, they were fixed on the man in the corner. Not on his suit. Not on his watch. Not on the quiet aura of wealth that clung to him even in stillness. But on something else. Something quieter. Something heavier. The way his shoulders didn't match the confidence people whispered about. The way his gaze didn't land on anything in the room, like he wasn't really there at all. Maya had seen men like him before. Powerful. Untouchable. Surrounded by everything people spent their lives chasing. But she had also seen something else. The moment when all of that stopped matching. She didn't know his story. Not yet. But she recognized the silence. And unlike everyone else in that room, she didn't look away. The room continued to move without him, like a river flowing around a stone that refused to shift, and Ethan remained exactly where he was, unmoved, untouched, as if time had decided to skip his table entirely. And yet inside him something kept ticking, slow and heavy, like a clock he could not silence. Because the truth was not that he had made a decision, it was that the decision had been waiting for him for a long time, building quietly behind closed doors and boardroom smiles and quarterly reports that always looked better on paper than they felt in his chest. And tonight it had finally caught up, not with noise, not with drama, but with a kind of quiet that left no room to hide. And across the room Maya shifted her weight slightly, adjusting the tray in her hand as another server brushed past her without noticing, her eyes never fully leaving him, not in a way that would be obvious, not in a way that would draw attention, but in the small, careful glances of someone who had learned how to observe without being seen. Because in places like this, seeing too much was not always welcome, and yet she had always done it. Anyway, ever since she was a kid sitting in the corner of her mother's kitchen watching adults talk like their words did not matter, learning early that people said the most when they thought no one important was listening, and Ethan, for all his power, looked like someone who had said everything he could and still had nothing left. His hand finally moved, not toward the menu, not toward the glass, but toward the edge of the table where his phone lay. And for a second it seemed like he might pick it up, might undo what he had just set in motion. But his fingers stopped halfway, hovering, then pulling back as if even that small act required more energy than he had left, and Maya noticed that too. The hesitation, the quiet retreat, and something in her expression shifted, not pity, not curiosity, but recognition, because hesitation like that did not come from confusion. It came from knowing exactly what something meant and not being ready to face it. The manager's voice cut softly through the staff area behind her, reminding everyone to stay sharp, to keep service smooth, to avoid unnecessary interaction with certain guests. And there was a subtle glance in Ethan's direction when he said it, a silent instruction wrapped in professionalism. But Maya did not respond, not outwardly. She simply nodded like the others, then turned, stepping away from the service station with measured calm. Her path not directly toward him, not yet, but closer, table by table, movement by movement, until the distance between them was no longer the length of the room, but just a few steps and a decision. And at Ethan's table the candle flickered slightly as the air shifted, the flame bending just enough to catch his attention. And for the first time in several minutes his eyes moved, not fully lifting, not searching the room, but noticing something small, something real. And in that moment the silence around him did not feel empty. It felt fragile, like it could break, if touched the right way. And Maya stopped just outside the edge of his space, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the kind that did not come from age but from pressure, from years of carrying. Things that never showed up in headlines. And for a brief second she did nothing, just stood there, not as a server, not as background, but as a person deciding whether or not to cross a line no one else in that room was willing to cross. Because sometimes the difference between walking away and stepping forward was not about rules, it was about courage. And Maya had learned a long time ago that the quiet moments were the ones that mattered most. There was a moment where the world seemed to hold its breath, not the entire room, not the laughter or the music or the quiet hum of expensive conversations, but the space between two people who were not supposed to matter to each other. And Maya stepped forward, just one step, soft enough that no one turned, but certain enough that it changed everything. And Ethan noticed, not because she made a sound, but because her presence interrupted the silence in a way that felt different, not intrusive, not demanding, just there, real. And he slowly lifted his eyes, not fully at first, just enough to acknowledge that someone had entered the edge of his world. And for a second neither of them spoke, because this was not a moment that needed words yet. This was a moment that needed understanding. And Maya did something unexpected. She did not reach for a menu. She did not ask if he was ready to order. She did not perform the script every other server followed. Instead, she placed a small white plate gently on the table in front of him, careful, precise, like the action itself mattered more than anything she could say. And on that plate was not a dish from the menu, not something expensive or decorative, but something simple, something warm, something that did not belong in a place like this. A small portion of grilled chicken with plain rice and a side of steamed vegetables. The kind of meal that felt more like home than luxury. And Ethan's eyes shifted, confusion first, subtle but real, his gaze moving from the plate to her, searching for explanation, for intention, for anything that made sense of what he was seeing. And Maya finally spoke, her voice calm, steady, not too loud, not too soft. "You have not eaten anything," she said, not as a question, not as a suggestion, just as a fact. And there was something in the way she said it that removed any room for pretense. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his brow tightening just enough to show resistance. Because this was not how things worked. Not for him. Not in places like this. People did not decide things for him. People waited for him to decide. And yet here she was, breaking that unspoken rule without hesitation. And for a brief moment, it looked like he might dismiss it, might wave her away like so many others had done to her before. But he did not. Instead, he looked at the plate again, longer this time, his eyes tracing the simplicity of it, the lack of presentation, the absence of performance. And something shifted, small but undeniable, because it had been a long time since anyone had offered him something without expecting anything in return, without trying to impress, without trying to sell. And Maya did not move. She did not explain further. She did not defend her choice. She simply stood there, giving him space to feel whatever he was going to feel. And Ethan's hand finally moved again, slower than before, more deliberate, reaching toward the fork resting beside the plate. and he paused just above it, as if even this required permission from a part of himself he had been ignoring. And in that hesitation, there was a memory forming, not clear yet, not fully present, but close enough to be felt, like a door slightly open in a room he had not entered in years, and Maya saw it. Not the memory itself, but the reaction, the way his posture softened by just a fraction, the way his breathing changed, and she knew then that she had chosen correctly, not because of what the food was, but because of what it represented, something familiar, something honest, something that did not care about titles or balance sheets. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell did not look like a man deciding the fate of a company. He looked like someone remembering something he had almost forgotten. The fork felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just weight, and Ethan's fingers tightened around it as he finally lifted it from the table, the subtle clink of metal against porcelain sounding louder to him than the entire room. And for a second, he hesitated again, staring at the simple meal in front of him as if it held an answer he was not ready to hear, because it was not the kind of food he had grown used to, not curated, not plated for attention, not designed to impress investors or clients or anyone who measured value by appearance. It was something else entirely, something that did not belong in a place where everything was meant to be seen. And that was exactly why it unsettled him. And Maya remained still, not watching him directly anymore, but close enough to notice every shift, every breath, every small surrender that came without words, because she understood that moments like this could not be forced, they had to be allowed. And Ethan finally took a bite, small, cautious, almost reluctant, as if he expected disappointment or indifference. But the moment the food touched his tongue, something changed, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else in the room would notice, but inside, where memory lives quietly, waiting for the right moment to return. And suddenly he was not in that restaurant anymore, not surrounded by polished glass and controlled conversations. He was somewhere else, somewhere smaller, warmer, a kitchen that did not care about perfection, a table that did not require reservations, a voice that did not measure him by what he built but by who he was. And his jaw slowed, the act of chewing becoming something deeper, something connected, and his eyes dropped, not to avoid the room but to hold on to that feeling for just a second longer, because it had been years, maybe longer, since anything had felt that honest. And Maya saw the shift without needing confirmation, the way his shoulders lowered slightly, the way the tension that had wrapped around him all night loosened just enough to let something human through. And she spoke again, not interrupting the moment, but guiding it. "My mom used to make that," she said quietly, her tone steady, like she was sharing something simple, not something meant to change him. And Ethan looked up this time, fully, his eyes meeting hers for the first time, without distance, without hierarchy, just two people in the same space. And there was a question there, not spoken but present. Why? Why this? Why now? Why him? And Maya answered without him asking. "People forget to eat when they are carrying too much," she added, her words landing gently but precisely. And something about that sentence reached further than the food ever could, because it was not about the meal anymore. It was about what he had been doing to himself for years, building, pushing, deciding, sacrificing pieces of his life until there was nothing left that felt like his own. And Ethan leaned back slightly, the fork still in his hand, his mind no longer racing forward to the next deal or the next decision, but pulling backward into something he had avoided, something he had buried under success and expectation and the illusion that control meant fulfillment. And for the first time that night, the decision he made earlier did not feel like strength. It felt like escape, and that realization sat heavier than anything else on the table. And Maya did not press further. She did not need to, because the moment had already begun to do its work, quietly, deeply, in a way that no boardroom ever could. And Ethan Caldwell, the man who could command entire industries with a sentence, now sat in silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was finally listening. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling between them like something that finally felt allowed to exist. And Ethan set the fork down slowly, not because he was done eating, but because something inside him had shifted in a way that made the act of eating feel secondary, almost symbolic. And his gaze drifted past Maya for a moment, not avoiding her, but searching through something only he could see. And when he spoke, his voice was different, softer, less controlled, like it no longer needed to perform. I used to eat like this every night, he said, not looking at her yet, the words coming out slower than he expected, as if they had been waiting for permission, before everything got bigger. And the last word lingered, not proud, not bitter, just uncertain. Like he was no longer sure what bigger had actually meant. And Maya listened without interrupting, without nodding too quickly or filling the space, because she understood that people like him were not used to saying things out loud unless there was a reason, unless there was leverage or outcome attached. And this was neither. This was just truth. And that made it fragile. And Ethan let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh. But there was no humor in it, just recognition. Funny thing is, he continued, now looking at the plate again, I thought I was building something that would give me more time, more freedom, more control. He paused, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table, grounding himself in something physical. But somewhere along the way, it just started taking everything instead. And that sentence hung in the air, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just honest. And Maya shifted slightly, resting the tray against her side now, no longer needing it as a shield. And she spoke carefully, not to challenge him, not to agree blindly, but to meet him where he was. Sometimes people build things to protect what matters, she said, her voice calm, steady, and then forget what they were protecting in the first place. And Ethan's eyes lifted again, sharper this time, not defensive but aware, because that landed closer than anything else had. And for a moment he said nothing, just studied her, not as a waitress, not as part of the background, but as someone who had just said something real without trying to impress him. And that alone made him pause, because in his world, everything came with intention, with strategy, with angles. But this did not. This felt clean, and that was unfamiliar. And he leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, the weight in his chest shifting into something more defined, something he could actually look at instead of run from. I made a decision tonight, he said, his tone more grounded now, less distant. A big one. And Maya nodded once, not asking what it was, not pushing for details, just acknowledging the weight of that statement. And Ethan continued, almost as if he needed to hear himself say it out loud again. I told them I was shutting it all down. And there it was, not dressed up, not framed as strategy, just a statement. And for a second he watched her reaction, maybe expecting surprise, maybe expecting concern, maybe even approval. But Maya did none of those things. She simply looked at him, steady, thoughtful, and asked one quiet question. Are you sure that is what you really want? Or is it just what feels easiest right now? And the question did not hit like a challenge. It landed like a mirror. And Ethan blinked once, caught off guard not by the words but by the clarity of them. Because no one had asked him that. Not his board, not his advisors, not the people who depended on his decisions. They had all reacted to the outcome, not the intention. And now here he was, being asked something simple, something direct, something that did not care about his title or his influence, only about his truth. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell did not have an answer ready. And that silence, that uncertainty, was not weakness. It was the beginning of something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. The question did not demand an answer. It waited for one. And that was what made it difficult, because Ethan was used to decisions that came with pressure, deadlines, consequences that forced clarity. But this was different. This was quiet. And in that quiet there was no place to hide behind urgency or expectation, only truth. And he leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting near the edge of the table, his hands loosely clasped as if trying to hold on to something that kept slipping through his fingers, and his eyes dropped again, not out of avoidance but because looking inward felt heavier than looking at anything in that room. I do not know, he said finally, the words simple but unfamiliar, because men like him were not supposed to say that, not out loud, not without immediately following it with a plan or a solution. But he did not have one, not tonight. And that honesty shifted something even further, like a door opening just a little wider. And Maya did not react with surprise or concern. She simply accepted it, because uncertainty was not something to fix. It was something to understand. And she stepped slightly to the side, placing the tray down on a nearby station, removing the last physical barrier between them, not as a gesture of importance, but as a quiet signal that this moment mattered. And when she spoke again, Her voice carried the same calm clarity. My mom used to say something when things felt too heavy, she began, her tone reflective, not performative. She would say, if you are about to walk away from something, make sure you are not actually running from something else. And the sentence landed softly, but it did not disappear. It stayed, settling into Ethan's mind in a way that made everything else in the room feel distant. And he exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest shifting into something more precise, more defined. Because for the first time, he was not just feeling overwhelmed. He was starting to see what was underneath it. And it was not the company, not the pressure, not even the expectations that had followed him for years. It was something older, something quieter, something he had been ignoring long before any of this had grown into what it was now. And his gaze drifted back to the plate, now half finished, the simplicity of it grounding him in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. And he picked up the fork again, not out of obligation, but because it felt like the right thing to do, like continuing something that had already started to change him. And as he took another bite, slower this time, more present, he spoke again, not looking at Maya, but not shutting her out either. I built everything so I would not have to feel small again, he admitted, the words quiet but steady. But I think I just made everything else disappear instead, and there was no self-pity in it, no attempt to justify or explain it away, just recognition. And Maya listened, her expression unchanged but her understanding deepening, because she knew that kind of realization did not come easily, especially not to someone who had spent years being rewarded for doing the opposite. And she nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Then maybe shutting it down is not the answer, she said gently. Maybe remembering why you built it is. And Ethan paused again. But this time the silence did not feel empty or uncertain. It felt active, like something was moving beneath the surface, aligning, connecting. And for the first time since he walked into that restaurant, the decision he had made earlier did not feel final. It felt incomplete. And that difference, small as it seemed, was everything. The idea did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like something that had been there all along but finally had the space to breathe. And Ethan sat back again, this time not retreating but recalibrating, his eyes no longer distant but focused in a quieter, steadier way, as if he was beginning to see something that had been buried under years of noise and expectation. And his fingers tapped lightly against the table, not impatiently, but thoughtfully, a rhythm forming as his mind started to connect pieces that had never quite fit before. And across from him Maya remained still, not guiding anymore, not adding more words, because she understood that this part did not belong to her. This was his to process, his to face. And Ethan's gaze shifted once more to the plate, now nearly empty. And there was something almost symbolic in that, something finished but not wasted. Something simple that had done more than any elaborate plan he had made in months. And he let out a slow breath. Longer this time, like he was releasing something he had been holding onto without realizing it. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, not heavier, but clearer. I thought ending it would fix everything, he admitted, his tone steady but reflective. Like if I removed the pressure, everything else would fall back into place. And he paused, his eyes lifting slightly. Not to Maya, not to the room, but somewhere in between, as if testing the truth of his own words. But maybe I was just trying to erase the problem instead of understanding it. And that realization settled deeper than anything before it, because it was not about the company anymore. It was about the pattern, the way he had learned to solve things by cutting them off, by moving on, by building something new instead of sitting with what already existed. And Maya watched that shift carefully, not interrupting, not validating too quickly, because she knew that clarity like this needed space to anchor itself. And Ethan reached for his phone again, this time without hesitation, his hand steady, his grip firm, and he turned it over slowly, the screen lighting up in the dim glow of the table, reflecting faintly in his eyes. And for a second, he just stared at it, the weight of what he had said earlier still fresh, still real, but no longer final. And he scrolled once, then stopped, his thumb hovering over a name that carried more than just a title. And there was no rush in his movement, no urgency, just intention. And Maya noticed that too, the difference between a reaction and a decision. And it mattered, because one came from fear and the other from understanding. And Ethan inhaled quietly, then pressed the call button, bringing the phone to his ear as he leaned slightly forward. His posture no longer closed off but engaged, and when the line connected, he did not speak immediately, not because he was unsure, but because he was choosing his words carefully for the first time that night. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, grounded, unmistakably present. "It is Ethan," he said, simple, direct. "I need to change what I said earlier." And there was a pause on the other end, one that would have unsettled him before, but now it did not, because this was not about control anymore. It was about clarity. "We are not shutting it down," he continued, his tone steady, not defensive, not uncertain, just resolved. "Not yet." And that last part mattered, because it was honest, because it left room for understanding instead of finality. And he listened for a moment, nodding slightly as the voice on the other end responded. And when he ended the call, he did not rush to put the phone down. He simply placed it gently beside the plate, like something that no longer needed to be escaped from. And for a moment, he just sat there, the noise of the restaurant slowly returning to him, not overwhelming, not distant, just part of the world again. And he looked up at Maya, really looked at her this time, not as a stranger, not as a role, but as the person who had stepped into a moment no one else had dared to touch. And there was something unspoken in that look, something close to gratitude, but deeper than that, because it was not about what she had done, it was about what she had allowed him to see. And in that quiet exchange, something fundamental had shifted, not in the room, not in the world, but in him, and that was where it mattered most. The air around the table felt different now, not lighter in a dramatic way, but clearer, like a fog that had slowly lifted without anyone noticing the exact moment it disappeared. And Ethan remained seated, but he was no longer hiding in the corner. He was present in it, aware of the room again, aware of himself. And that alone was a shift he could not ignore. And his eyes moved across the restaurant with a quiet curiosity, noticing details that had been there all along but had not mattered. Until now, the way people leaned into conversations, the way laughter rose and fell without calculation, the way life continued without needing permission from someone like him. And for the first time in a long time, he did not feel separate from it. He felt part of it. And that realization did not come with excitement. It came with a kind of calm that settled deep in his chest, grounding him in something real. And he looked back at Maya, still standing near the edge of the table, not waiting, not expecting, just there. And there was something in that presence that stayed with him, something that did not demand recognition but earned it anyway. And he spoke again, his voice steady, but this time carrying something new. "You did not have to do any of this," he said, not as a question, not as a statement of obligation, but as an acknowledgement of choice. And Maya tilted her head slightly, considering his words before responding, not rushing to fill the silence, because she knew this was not about gratitude in the usual sense. This was about understanding, and she answered simply, "Sometimes people need someone to see them before they can see themselves." And the sentence landed softly, but it stayed, echoing in a way that did not fade. And Ethan let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh. But this time there was something warmer in it, something closer to relief than tension, and he nodded once, not because he fully understood everything yet, but because he understood enough to know that this moment mattered, and enough to know that it would stay with him long after he left that table. And he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a card, not with the intention of offering it as a transaction, not as a gesture of power or obligation, but as something else entirely, something more personal. And he placed it on the table, sliding it slightly toward her, but not pushing it, not insisting, just leaving it there as an option. "If you ever want something different," he said, his tone calm, not persuasive, not commanding, "you can call me." And Maya looked at the card, then back at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, not impressed, not dismissive, just thoughtful. And she did not reach for it immediately, because she understood what it represented, not just an opportunity, but a shift in how he saw her. And that mattered more than anything written on that piece of paper. And she nodded once, acknowledging it without attaching expectation. "Thank you," she said simply. And then, without adding more, without changing the tone of the moment, she reached forward and picked up the empty plate, her movements smooth, professional, but now carrying something more. Something that did not come from training, but from connection, and Ethan watched her for a second longer as she turned and walked back toward the service area, not disappearing into the background the way she had before, but leaving a presence behind that lingered at the table. And he sat there for a moment after she was gone, not rushing to leave, not reaching for his phone again, just sitting in the quiet that no longer felt heavy. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell was not thinking about what he had lost or what he needed to fix. He was thinking about what he had just found, and that changed everything. The chair scraped softly against the floor as Ethan finally stood, not abruptly, not with the urgency that usually followed his movements, but with a kind of deliberate calm that felt unfamiliar and yet right. And he adjusted his jacket out of habit before realizing he did not need to, because for once he was not stepping into a room to command it. He was simply leaving one that had already changed him. And as he moved toward the exit, the restaurant no longer felt like a stage or a battlefield of quiet power. It felt like a place where something honest had happened, something that would not show up in headlines or quarterly reports but would stay with him in ways those things never could. And the conversations around him continued. The soft music played on. The world did not pause to mark the moment. And that was the point. Because the most important changes rarely came with applause. They came quietly, in corners, in moments no one else noticed. And as he reached the door, he paused for just a second, not to look back at the room, but to take in the feeling of clarity that had replaced the weight he carried in with him. And it was not perfect, it was not complete, but it was real, and that was enough. And outside, the night air met him with a cool steadiness, the city lights stretching out in front of him, constant, indifferent, alive, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel the need to control it or outpace it. He just stood there, breathing it in, letting the moment settle, and his phone buzzed, softly in his pocket, a reminder that the world he had built was still there, still moving, still waiting for him. But now it felt different, not like a burden he needed to escape from, but like something he needed to understand, and he pulled it out, glancing at the screen before locking it again without responding. Because not every call needed to be answered immediately, not every decision needed to be made in urgency, and that realization alone felt like a kind of freedom he had been chasing for years without knowing it. And inside the restaurant, Maya returned to her rhythm, moving from table to table, clearing, serving, listening without being seen, the same as before, and yet not the same at all. Because something in her had shifted too, not in a way that changed her path, but in a way that confirmed it, that reminded her that small moments carried weight far beyond what people gave them credit for. And as she passed by the corner where Ethan had been sitting, she paused just for a second, not out of attachment, but out of recognition, and then continued on, because that was what she did. She showed up, she paid attention, she acted when it mattered, and she moved forward without needing anything in return. And somewhere between that quiet corner and the city outside, a man who once believed power was measured by control had learned something far more valuable, something that could not be bought or built or negotiated, only remembered. And he would carry that with him into every room he walked into from that night on, not as a story to tell, but as a way to see. Because sometimes the most powerful thing that can happen to a person is not being changed by force, but being reminded of who they were before the world told them who to become. And that night, without raising her voice, without asking for recognition, without trying to prove anything at all, Maya Brooks did